Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
We have traveled a little road together, haven't we? Across 6 episodes, we have traced the architecture of what I have called the new Leviathan, the system of emergency governance that has transformed the American Republic over the last quarter century. We began with September 11, 2001, and the Patriot Act that made surveillance permanent. We traced how Silicon Valley's commercial data collection merged with government intelligence to create a system of comprehensive observation. We examined how the Federal Reserve evolved from lender of last resort to the engine of unlimited monetary expansion. We documented how welfare and security databases fused into a system of managed citizenship. And we witnessed how the COVID pandemic activated all of these systems simultaneously, revealing the administrative state's capacity for comprehensive control. And then last episode, we examined the digital infrastructure being built to make that control permanent. CBDCs, ESG, and the elimination of cash. You might say it's a grim catalog. 6 episodes documenting the erosion of constitutional limits, the expansion of administrative power, the transformation of citizens from rights bearers to credentials. But documentation is not destiny. Diagnosis is not defeat. Throughout history, free people have faced concentrations of power and found ways to resist, reform, and restore. The question is not whether the new Leviathan exists. It does. The question is whether it can be constrained, rolled back, and ultimately dismantled. This final episode asks that question, not with naive optimism, but with a clear-eyed assessment of the past that remain open, not with despair, but with the recognition that liberty has never been preserved by those who believed preservation impossible. The emergency has become infinite. But infinity is a long time. And free people have surprised tyrants before. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions podcast. This is episode 7, the final episode of the series, The New Leviathan, from 9/11 to COVID and the return of emergency power. Today, the infinite emergency, restoring liberty in the age of the new Leviathan. Before we can discuss solutions, we must be clear about the problems that we face. Let me summarize what this series has established. The surveillance state is not a conspiracy theory. It's a documented fact. The NSA's bulk collection programs, revealed by Edward Snowden, captured the communications of millions of Americans without individualized warrants. The Patriot Act, Section 215, was used to justify mass data collection that even its authors never intended. The FISA court, designed to provide oversight, approved more than 99% of government requests. The surveillance infrastructure built to fight terrorism was turned inward toward the American people. The monetary state is not an abstraction. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet grew from under $1 trillion in 2008 to over $9 trillion by 2022. Quantitative easing, the creation of money to purchase government debt, became permanent policy rather than emergency intervention. Interest rates were suppressed for more than a decade, distorting capital allocation across the entire economy. The resulting inflation transferred wealth from savers and wage earners to asset owners and first recipients of the new money. And the administrative state is not a neutral bureaucracy. It's a fourth branch of government that writes rules with the force of law, enforces those rules through its own proceedings, and adjudicates disputes through its own tribunals. The citizen who faces an administrative agency confronts an entity that is simultaneously legislator, executive, and judiciary. Precisely the concentration of power the founders designed the Constitution to prevent. The welfare security fusion is not accidental. The same databases that track benefit eligibility track security risk. The same systems that credential essential workers can designate dissidents. The same infrastructure that froze bank accounts of Canadian truckers can freeze accounts of anyone deemed problematic by those who control the system. And the digital cage is not future speculation. CBDCs are being developed by more than 100 central banks. ESG frameworks are becoming mandatory for public companies. Cash is being marginalized through a combination of policy, technology, and social pressure. The infrastructure for comprehensive financial surveillance and control is being built in plain sight. Throughout this series, we have observed a consistent pattern. Emergency powers expand during crises and never fully contract. The Patriot Act sunset provisions were renewed and made permanent. The Federal Reserve's emergency interventions became standard policy. COVID restrictions that were temporary persisted for years, and the precedents remain available for the next emergency. This is not coincidence. It's the nature of power to expand. Madison understood this. Hamilton understood this. Every serious student of government has understood this. The question is not whether those who hold power will seek more power. They will. The question is whether institutions, culture, and citizenry exist to constrain that expansion. For most of the 20th century, the answer was barely. Constitutional limits eroded gradually through court decisions that deferred to administrative expertise, through congressional delegations that transferred legislative power to agencies, through executive actions that expanded presidential authority. In the 21st century, the erosion accelerated. September 11th justified the surveillance state, the 2008 financial crisis justified the monetary state, and COVID justified the emergency state. Each crisis provided the justification for powers that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. The new Leviathan was not built in a day. It was built crises by crises, emergency by emergency, precedent by precedent. It can only be dismantled the same way, deliberately, persistently, across multiple fronts. The Constitution remains the supreme law of the land. Its limits on federal power have been circumvented, but they have not been repealed. The path to restoration begins with reasserting those limits. Congress delegated its powers to the administrative state. Congress can reclaim them. The REINS Act, the Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act. These names they come up with, I tell you what. The REINS Act would require congressional approval for any major regulation before it takes effect. Under current law, agencies issue thousands of rules each year, most of which will never receive a congressional vote. The REINS Act would restore legislative accountability by requiring Congress to affirmatively approve significant regulations. The act has passed the House of Representatives multiple times, but has not passed the Senate. It does represent a direct reassertion of Article 1 authority, the principle that legislative power belongs to the legislature. Similarly, Congress could reassert control over emergency powers. The National Emergency Act of 1976 was designed to limit presidential emergency declarations by requiring congressional review. But the review mechanism has proven toothless. Presidents declare emergencies, Congress rarely terminates them. Reform proposals would require affirmative congressional approval to continue emergencies beyond initial periods, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever. Without congressional action, the emergency would automatically expire. This would then shift the burden of Congress from having to act to terminate to having to act to continue. It's like opt out versus opt in. And it's a much better way to handle emergency management. The Federal Reserve's independence, actually its insulation from democratic accountability, could also be addressed legislatively. Audit the Fed proposals championed by Ron Paul for decades, subsequently by Thomas Massey and Rand Paul, would subject the Federal Reserve to comprehensive auditing by the Federal Government Accountability Office, including its monetary policy decisions. More ambitious reforms would limit the Fed's mandate entirely, constrain its balance sheet, or require congressional approval for quantitative easing beyond specified thresholds. Could even go so far as to end the Fed. Now, on the judiciary side, the courts have begun to push back against administrative overreach. Tentatively, incompletely, but still somewhat meaningfully. In West Virginia versus EPA in 2022, the Supreme Court invoked the major questions doctrine, the principle that agencies cannot claim authority over questions of vast economic and political significance without clear congressional authorization. The court held that the EPA could not restructure the nation's energy grid under general statutory language. Congress must speak clearly when it delegates major policy decisions. Now, this doctrine, if consistently applied, would constrain agency power significantly. Many of the administrative state's most consequential actions rest on broad statutory language that agencies interpret expansively. Requiring clear congressional authorization would force Congress to take responsibility for major policy choices rather than delegating them to bureaucrats. And with forcing Congress to take responsibility, there is accountability. Remember, bureaucrats are not elected and have to face re-election. Congress members do. That's where the accountability comes into play. In NFIB versus Department of Labor, the court struck down OSHA's vaccine mandate on similar grounds. The agency had claimed vast authority over 84 million workers based on workplace safety statute that had never been used for nationwide medical requirements. These decisions suggest a judiciary increasingly skeptical of administrative claims to unbounded authority. But judicial enforcement depends on cases reaching courts, on having standing to sue, on judges willing to enforce constitutional limits, on 9 men and women. It is necessary, but not sufficient. The federal system provides another path: state resistance to federal overreach. Nullification, the theory that states can refuse to enforce unconstitutional federal laws. Though it does have a complicated history. It was invoked by slaveholding states to resist federal authority before the Civil War, and that association has made many Americans still uncomfortable with the concept. But the underlying principle is sound. Federalism means that states are not mere administrative units of the national government. They retain their own sovereignty in their spheres. They can refuse to cooperate with federal programs. They can create sanctuaries from federal enforcement. During COVID, some governors resisted federal pressure for lockdowns and mandates. Florida, Texas, South Dakota, and others ended restrictions early, refused to implement mask mandates, and protected businesses from federal vaccine requirements. These states demonstrated that federalism still provides meaningful alternatives, that citizens can choose to live under different policies by choosing where to live. Second Amendment sanctuaries provide another example. Hundreds of counties in several states have declared that they will not enforce federal gun control laws they consider unconstitutional. Whether one agrees with the specific policy, the mechanism is significant. Local governments asserting that their cooperation is not automatic, that federal enforcement depends on state and local assistance that can be withdrawn. Immigration sanctuaries operate on the same principle, from the opposite political direction. Cities and states that refuse to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement demonstrate that the federal government cannot govern the entire country without state and local cooperation. Thus, the principle is bipartisan, even if its applications are contested. Federalism provides exit options. When citizens can move to states with different policies and when states can resist federal mandates, the national government's power is constrained by competition and choice. Ultimately, in a democracy, policy reflects the preference of those who vote and those who govern. The political class responds to incentives. When voters reward politicians who expand government, government expands. When voters reward politicians who limit government, limits become possible. The challenge is that the benefits of government expansion are concentrated while the costs are diffused. Those who receive subsidies, contracts, and protections know exactly what they gain. Those who pay through taxes, inflation, and lost liberty often do not perceive those losses clearly. But political coalitions shift. The New Deal coalition that dominated American politics for 50 years eventually fractured. The Reagan coalition that replaced it itself has fragmented. New alignments are possible. The liberty movement, broadly defined to include libertarians, constitutional conservatives, civil libertarians on the left, and independents, is skeptical of concentrated power, and it itself represents a political coalition. Its members disagree on many issues, but share a common concern that the state has grown too powerful, too intrusive, too unaccountable. Building that coalition requires education, helping citizens understand what has been done to their liberty and why it matters. It requires organization, translating diffuse concerns into political action. And it requires candidates who are willing to challenge the administrative state rather than merely capture it. None of this is easy, but it is not impossible. Political change happens when enough people decide that their current path is unacceptable and organize to change it. If the new Leviathan depends on centralized infrastructure, centralized surveillance, centralized money, centralized identity, then decentralized alternatives represent a form of structural resistance. The internet was originally designed as a decentralized network, a system with no central point of control, no single authority that could shut it down. That design reflected Cold War concerns. A network that could survive nuclear attack because no single node was essential. Over time, the internet became more centralized. A handful of platforms dominate communication. A handful of cloud providers host most services, and a handful of domain registrars and payment processors can disconnect anyone from the digital economy. But the original decentralized architecture still exists. And new technologies are rebuilding decentralization into layers that had become centralized. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies represent an attempt to create money outside of central bank control. Bitcoin is not anonymous. Its blockchain is public and sophisticated, and analysts can trace transactions to identities. But it's permissionless. No central authority can prevent you from receiving Bitcoin or sending it. No bank can freeze your Bitcoin wallet. No government can inflate your Bitcoin holdings by creating more. Whether Bitcoin succeeds as money, whether it achieves stable value, broad acceptance, and practical utility, remains uncertain. Its volatility has limited its use as a medium of exchange. Its energy consumption has drawn criticism. Its learning curve has limited adoption. But the principle it demonstrates is powerful. Money can exist without central banks. Transactions can occur without intermediaries. Financial privacy can be preserved through technology rather than depending on policy. Privacy-focused cryptocurrencies like Monero go further, building anonymity into the protocol itself. Other projects focus on layer 2 solutions that enable faster, cheaper, and more private transactions while inheriting the security of underlying blockchains. Now, I'm not arguing that cryptocurrency will definitely succeed or that everyone should adopt it. I am arguing that its existence provides an exit, an alternative to the CBDC future we examined in episode 6. As long as alternatives exist, the digital cage cannot fully close. Encryption provides similar protection for communication. End-to-end encrypted messaging, Signal for example, ensures that only the sender and recipient can read the messages. The service provider cannot access the content. Government subpoenas cannot retrieve what does not exist in readable form. Encryption has become standard in many applications. Apple's iMessage is end-to-end encrypted. WhatsApp uses the Signal protocol. Even Facebook Messenger now offers encrypted options. Governments have sought to mandate backdoors, access points that would allow law enforcement to read encrypted communication without proper authentication. With proper authorization. Well, it depends on who you ask. Security experts have consistently warned that backdoors can not be limited to the good guys. And this is true. Any vulnerability created for the government access can be exploited by criminals, foreign adversaries, or any malicious actors. So the encryption debate will certainly continue, but the technology exists. It's widely deployed and provides meaningful protection against the surveillance capabilities we documented in episode 1 and 2. And emerging technologies offer alternatives to centralized digital identity. Self-sovereign identity systems allow individuals to control their own identity credentials without depending on centralized authorities. You could prove your age without revealing your birth date. You could prove your citizenship without exposing your social security number. You could authenticate yourself without creating a permanent record in a government database. These systems are still developing. They face challenges of adoption, interoperability, and usability. But they represent a technological path away from the comprehensive digital identity structure being built by governments worldwide. Similarly, decentralized storage and computing protects that distributed data and processing across networks of independent nodes, reducing dependence on centralized cloud providers who can be pressured by governments or who can unilaterally deny service. Now, I must be honest about limitations. Technology alone cannot preserve liberty. A sufficient determined government can ban technologies, criminalize their use, and punish those who employ them. China has largely succeeded in preventing its citizens from using Western internet services. Authoritarian regimes have imprisoned people for using encryption. Technological solutions require a legal and cultural environment that tolerates their existence. They are complements to political and constitutional remedies, not substitutes. But technology shifts the balance of power. It raises the cost of control. It creates friction that surveillance must overcome. Even if it cannot prevent tyranny, it can make tyranny more difficult. And that difficulty matters. The printing press did not guarantee freedom of the press, but it made censorship harder. The internet did not guarantee free speech, but it enabled communication that would have been impossible under older technologies. Decentralized technologies extend this tradition. They are tools, not solutions. But tools in the hands of free people can accomplish remarkable things. Now, constitutional amendments can be repealed. Laws can change. Technologies can be banned. The deeper question is whether the culture that produced the Constitution, the habits, beliefs, and character that make self-government possible can be renewed. The founders did not believe that the parchment alone could preserve liberty. They believed that liberty required a particular kind of citizen, educated, virtuous, vigilant, jealous of their rights, and suspicious of power. John Adams wrote, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." He did not mean that only Christians could be free. He meant that self-government requires self-discipline. A people who cannot govern themselves will be governed by others. A people who trade liberty for security will lose both. Throughout this series, we have seen how the promise of safety has been used to justify the erosion of liberty. The surveillance state promises safety from terrorism. The monetary state promises safety from recession. The administrative state promises safety from risk. And the COVID state promised safety from disease. The digital cage promises safety from fraud, crime, and disorder. Each promise carries a price: liberty. The transaction is never stated explicitly. It's presented as a gift, protection offered by a benevolent state to vulnerable citizens. But the transaction is very real. And the culture that accepts it, that prioritizes safety over liberty, comfort over autonomy, protection over self-reliance, is a culture that will not resist the new Leviathan. It will welcome it. Cultural renewal means recovering the understanding that liberty is not a luxury to be traded away, but a necessity to be defended. That risk is inherent in life and cannot be eliminated by government. That the attempt to eliminate risk through control creates greater risk, the risk of tyranny, of stagnation, of dependency, of the loss of human dignity that comes from being managed rather than being free. Cultural renewal begins with education, not propaganda, but genuine understanding. Citizens who do not understand their Constitution cannot defend it. Citizens who do not know their history cannot recognize when it repeats. Citizens who have never encountered the arguments for liberty cannot articulate them when challenged. This series has been an exercise in education, not partisan advocacy, but the recovery of knowledge that was once common and has become rare. The founders' debates, the constitutional design, the economic principles that underlie free markets, the historical patterns that show how liberty is lost and how it is preserved. Such education happens in many places. Home schools and private schools that teach constitutional principles, colleges that preserve liberal education against ideological capture, think tanks that produce rigorous research, podcasts and Substacks that reach audiences that legacy media ignores, conversations between parents and children, between friends and neighbors, between citizens who care about their country's future. The administrative state controls public education, but it does not control all education. And the ideas it suppresses have a way of surviving, passed from generation to generation by those who remember what was lost and hope for its restoration. Finally, cultural renewal requires the cultivation of character. Liberty requires courage, the willingness to speak when speaking is costly, to stand when standing is lonely, to resist when resistance brings consequences. Liberty requires prudence, the wisdom to distinguish between battles worth fighting and battles that waste resources, between principles that cannot be compromised and tactics that can be adjusted. Liberty requires temperance, the self-discipline to govern one's own appetites and passions, to delay gratification, to build rather than consume. Liberty requires justice, the commitment to render to each what is due, to respect the rights of others, to maintain the conditions under which free people can live together peacefully. These are classical virtues articulated by Aristotle, developed by the Stoics, incorporated into Christian tradition, assumed by the founders. They are not uniquely American, but they are essential to the American experience. A people who possess these virtues can govern themselves. A people who lack them cannot. No matter what their constitution says, no matter what technologies they deploy, no matter what laws they pass. Cultural renewal is the hardest path. It cannot be legislated or coded or mandated. It happens person by person, family by family, community by community. It happens through example and instruction, through practice and habit, through the slow work of forming souls. But it is the path that matters most. Laws without virtue become instruments of oppression. Technologies without wisdom become tools of control. Constitutions without citizens who understand and cherish them become parchment and nothing more. I want to be honest about the difficulty of what lies ahead. The new Leviathan is deeply entrenched. It commands vast resources. It employs millions. It has captured institutions across government, academia, media, and finance. It benefits powerful interests who will resist any attempt to constrain it. Those who challenge the administrative state face an asymmetric contest. The state can marshal resources that no private citizen or organization can match. It can regulate, investigate, audit, and prosecute. It can make examples of those who resist. And yet, the Soviet Union seemed permanent until it wasn't. The Berlin Wall seemed eternal until it fell. Jim Crow seemed unshakable until it crumbled. History is filled with systems that seemed invincible until the moment they collapsed. The new Leviathan has weaknesses. It depends on compliance, and compliance can be withdrawn. It depends on legitimacy, and legitimacy can erode. It depends on competence, and bureaucrats become sclerotic. It depends on resources, and resources can be exhausted. Most importantly, it depends on citizens who have forgotten what liberty means and why it matters. When citizens remember, when they demand accountability, when they resist encroachment, when they organize and vote and speak and build alternatives, the calculus changes. Restoration will not come from a single strategy. It will require action across multiple fronts simultaneously. Politically, Elect representatives committed to constitutional limits, support legislation that constrains administrative power, oppose legislation that expands it, engage in state and local politics where individual citizens have more influence. Legally, support organizations that litigate against administrative overreach. Encourage judicial nominees who take constitutional limits seriously. Use the courts to challenge unconstitutional actions. Technologically, adopt decentralized alternatives where they exist. Support the development of privacy-preserving technologies. Use encryption. Maintain the ability to transact outside surveilled systems. Culturally, educate yourself and others about constitutional principles. Teach your children. Support institutions that preserve liberal education. Build communities of people who share your values. Personally, cultivate the virtues that make self-government possible. Practice courage in small things so that it is available in large ones. Model the character you want to see in your fellow citizens. No single individual can do all these things, but every individual can do some of them. And when enough individuals act, movements form. When movements persist, change becomes possible. The administrative state was not built in a day. It will not be dismantled in a day. The progressive movement began in the 1890s. It took 40 years to achieve its major objectives in the New Deal. The conservative counter-revolution began in the 1950s. It took 30 years to achieve its partial successes in the Reagan era. Those who seek to restore constitutional government must think in decades, not election cycles. They must build institutions that outlast individuals. They must raise children who will continue the work. They must plant trees whose shade they will never enjoy. This is not a counsel for passivity. It's a counsel for persistence. The work begins now, but it does not end now. It continues as long as there are free people who remember what was lost and labor to restore it. So, let me draw together the threads of this entire series. We have traveled from September 11th, 2001 to the present day. From the Patriot Act to CBDCs. From the war on terror to the COVID state. From the founder's constitutional design to its systematic circumvention. We have documented the surveillance state that watches the monetary state, that funds the administrative state, that manages the digital infrastructure being built to make control comprehensive and permanent. We have called this system the new Leviathan, not because it is monstrous in intention, but because it is monstrous in scale. Thomas Hobbes imagined Leviathan as a solution to chaos, an all-powerful sovereign that would provide order in exchange for liberty. The new Leviathan offers that same bargain. Safety for freedom, security for autonomy, management for self-government. But we have also examined the paths that remain open. Constitutional reassertion, Congress claiming its legislative power, courts enforcing limits on administrative authority, states resisting federal overreach. Technological alternatives, decentralized money, encrypted communication, self-sovereign identity, tools that preserve privacy and autonomy in a surveillance age. Cultural renewal. Education in constitutional principles. Cultivation of the virtues that make self-government possible. The slow work of forming citizens who understand and cherish their liberty. The emergency has become infinite. Those who govern have discovered that crises justifies powers they could never claim in calm. And there is always another crisis. Terrorism, financial collapse, pandemic, climate, whatever comes next. But infinity is a long time. And the human spirit has a way of asserting itself against systems designed to contain it. The founders knew that liberty was not natural, that power naturally concentrates, that freedom requires vigilance, that each generation must earn anew what previous generations won. They did not promise the republic would last forever. They only promised that it could last if citizens proved worthy of it. Benjamin Franklin, famously leaving the Constitutional Convention in 1787, was asked what kind of government the delegates had created. A republic, he replied, if you can keep it. The question remains. It is not answered by documents or institutions alone. It is answered by what we do, each of us, in our own lives, in our own communities, in our own small sphere of influence. The new Leviathan is vast, but it is made of human decisions, and human decisions can be changed. The emergency is infinite, but so is the human desire for freedom. Cage may be digital, but the spirit that resists it is not. I began this series by asking, how much power should government wield, and what happens when it exceeds its proper bounds? The answer is not found in a single policy or a single election. It is found in the accumulated choices of millions of citizens who decide each day whether to accept the bargain Leviathan offers or insist on something better. The choice is yours. It has always been yours. May you choose wisely, and may your choice be worthy of the inheritance you received. Thank you for joining me throughout this constitutional history. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been The New Leviathan, from 9/11 to COVID and the return of emergency power on the Consequential Actions podcast. This concludes our 7-part series, but it does not conclude the conversation. If you have found value in this exploration of history, constitutional principle, and the future of liberty, I invite you to continue at consequentialactions.com. Subscribe to our Substack page for written articles that expand on these themes. Follow me on X at @jkellick for ongoing analysis and discussion. From our prequel series on the General Welfare Clause to our detailed examination of political theory, economics, and technology, we continue to post articles and welcome your participation. The New Leviathan is a story of where we are. What comes next is the story we write together. Until then, have a great day.